Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 29th of January, and in today's video we're going to be looking at Novomykhailivka, Avdiivka, and the Oskil riverfronts. Let's begin by looking at what's going on around Novomykhailivka, with a particular emphasis on the village's northern flank, where we have seen advances as reported on by Deep State on the 28th of January. And so in terms of the Russian territorial gains up to that point, the Russian forces were able to gain around 3 square kilometers of territory, which does include some open fields, but also tree lines, trenches, and in particular the Zhverenets fortification system, which we will get into as we talk about this sector. But really, the Russian advances generally on the northern flank started around over a month ago now, like a month and a half ago, at the same time the Russian forces were advancing deeper and deeper into Marinka. And so that sort of relieved pressure off of the south and gave the Russians more cover as they started launching attacks along some of these roads that are located in the fields southwards, and that allowed the Russians to open up additional vectors for pressure on the Ukrainians. And so the Russians took advantage of that, and you can see this polygon over here. This characterizes some of Russia's most recent gains around the course of about a month in this sector to the north of Novomykhailivka. Now, on the 23rd of January, the Russian forces renewed their attacks along this northern front, and it was confirmed by this video that was recorded by the Ukrainian side and was geolocated to the area that's just a bit to the west of the previous front line. This armored assault was likely led by the 39th Motor Rifle Brigade, a unit which has really been launching most of its armored assaults on the southern flank, but again, this is a bit to the north. And so they launched assault on the 23rd with at least 2 MTLBs and 1 BMP-3 in addition to several tanks. And so in this entire sector, it's been characterized by a stiff resistance of Ukraine's 79th Air Assault Brigade, where they've been countering by really increasing the density of the mines that they have placed in preparation for the Russian assaults. And so you do have a large amount of mines that have been placed throughout recent months along the line of contact. You also have mobile ATGM crews of the 79th, and in some instances the 79th has sent in some of their own armored elements, including tanks, to fight back against the Russian armored assaults. So in this case, they were able to show off the results of the Russian attack, which was largely repelled in this instance on the 23rd. In the course of the assault, an MTLB was actually destroyed by a mine, and then another one was abandoned, while 2 tanks and 1 BMP-3 were just abandoned. And then on the 28th, we received additional footage just to the north as the Russian forces shifted focus away from assaulting the fields directly towards clearing out the Zhverenets fortification system itself, which has been used by the Ukrainians throughout the entirety of the war as a forward operating base. It's important for several reasons. It's located on a hill. It's an area where you have machine guns planted. It's an observation point, and it gives you this sort of local control of the roads. For instance, the road that's leading from the northeast into Novomykhailivka. And when I say heights, I mean that all of this area over here that I'm marking in red is located on a ridge that overlooks the Ukrainian positions that are within Novomykhailivka and within the fields and roads to the north of it. And so you get a very good view of those Ukrainian positions from the Zhverenets fortification system. The goal of the assault was to send in the armored column along this road that I'm marking in red, and then to dismount infantry squads to get control over the fortification system. Now, throughout the attack, 1 tank was actually destroyed, another was abandoned, and then there was also an MTLB that was abandoned, and another BMP-2 was destroyed specifically by FPV drone strikes, and this was caught on video by the Ukrainian side. There was actually a Russian infantry squad that was stationed at the top of this BMP-2, and so they were riding on top of it, likely with the aim of quickly dismounting once they reached the proximity of the Zhverenets system. And so once they actually made it to that point, which I've marked over here, they were struck by the FPV, and this was a direct hit, so most of the squad was killed, although I'm pretty sure there was 1 who survived. In any case, despite the Ukrainian resistance, which included that drone component, which led to several vehicular losses, Deep State actually changed their map on the 28th to indicate that the Russians have full control over this fortification system and actually expanded further westwards, taking over additional fields and tree lines along the way, with the new Ukrainian line being based along this particular road and some of its adjacent fortifications. Now, moving on to Avdiivka, on the 28th, Deep State also reported on a Ukrainian retreat from some of their forwardmost positions just to the northeast of Opitny. As you can see on the map, the Russian line of control around Opitny is really very close to the outskirts of the village, which has put some pressure on the Russians that are trying to organize their forward echelons in that area. And so it seems like the Russians tried to put pressure on the Ukrainian squads that were operating nearby in order to allow the Russians to fully develop their positions in that area. And so now, according to deep states, that pressure was significant enough to cause the Ukrainians that were located over here in this area that I'm now going over with the red perimeter to withdraw. And they've basically withdrawn to positions that are deeper within the Ukrainian lines and likely are trying to consolidate and strengthen those particular positions, which would include the Zhvarinets fortification, or sorry, Zenit fortification system. The Zenit fortification system, if you recall, there were a lot of rumors at the beginning of Russia's breakthrough in southern Avdiivka that this system had also fallen, this abandoned air defense base. But now that the dust has settled, we do not have any confirmation of a Russian success in taking over this position. And so the Ukrainian garrison in this area does likely hold its positions and may have incorporated some of the Ukrainian troops that withdrew from their positions that were very, very close to Opitny. And so Russia will still have to deal with a stronghold, although now the Russians have an advantage because they have been able to chip away at some of the nearby fields that are surrounding the southern outskirts of the system, and they also have positions located to the north of it that are enveloping it from the northeast around the residential quarters of Avdiivka that are very, very close to the roads and the fields that are used to supply the Ukrainian garrison located in this salient. Now, moving on to southern Avdiivka, we now have footage that was released actually by the Russian side, which does depict a Ukrainian counterattack, which occurred likely about a week ago on the 20th or the 21st of January, when the Russians had already developed their initial success and the Ukrainians were quickly gathering their reinforcements for a counterattack. And this gives us confirmation of the Ukrainians sending in additional brigades that have previously not been around the southern Avdiivka to help turn the tides. And so previously, as we talked about, the 110th Mechanized Brigade was really the only unit that was defending the fortification systems around here. But in the new video released by Russia, we could see that there was involvement from the 116th Mechanized Brigade and the 47th Mechanized Brigade. Both these units were really extremely important in holding the line for Ukraine on the northern flank of Avdiivka, around Stepove, around the coke plant, Berdichi, and in that regard, they were successful. But now, due to this Russian success further south, they have at least certain elements of those units been moved southwards to try to conduct that counterattack. And so we have the geolocation for the development of this Ukrainian assault, which really started along this road over here, this main road. And this was, again, like a week ago. And so it's not indicative of the current front lines, but it is still important to look back at the way that the battle unfolded. And so, accompanied by this Ukrainian assault, you had tanks that were involved, M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, M113 armored personnel carriers. So they all advanced along this road. You had Ukrainian infantry that dismounted, and these were several squads that dismounted in this garage area and tried to take over those positions, although they were engaged by Russian FPV drones. And at a certain point in time, you had Ukrainian infantry, a few that were able to re-enter the Tsarska Ohota fortification system. The fortifications are actually further north around here, but there is a facility over here with houses that the Ukrainians entered, and those troops were actually struck by FPV drones. And so for now, it appears that the Russians do still have control over this area, and that eventually the Ukrainian counterattack in this area died down. But even according to Russian sources from this region, there is still some fluidity in the situation to the north of Tsarska Ohota. So what I mean by that is the forested area to the north is likely still a gray zone where we don't have a full idea of what's going on, where there could still be some Ukrainian attacks and some combing operations that the Russians have not finished with yet. But at the same time, the Russian forces have slowly expanded their control in the residential quarter. So we have this new video that was released by the 110th Mechanized Brigade. They're still operating in this area. they are now conducting a lot of FPV drone strikes and releasing them. In their most recent compilation, there were 14 strikes. And in this strike, this is the most interesting one. It was on a Russian a house where Russian units were stationed on the front line. And this would indicate that the Russian forces were able to advance through this particular part of the residential area and solidify control over it. This is really something that I should have mentioned in my last video, but I will now. On the 26th of January, the Ukrainians launched their own localized counterattack on the northern flank of Avdiivka, and this was backed up by this geolocated footage, which shows Russian drones dropping grenades on a Ukrainian trench that they just entered during their counterattack. So the trench was located over here, really very, very close to the rail line itself, where you do have similar trenches that were set up by Ukrainians or then the Russians once they took it over. And so the Ukrainians, they have not been able to actually reach the rail line itself in areas that the Russians had previously taken over, but they are very close to it now based on this geolocated footage, which does indicate a minor Ukrainian advance along this direction over here. But at the same time, the Ukrainians are still striking the Russian trenches. And the reason why it's so interesting is because this compilation that was released, I think, on the 23rd of January, was released by the 23rd Mechanized Brigade. This brigade, they showed their FPVs hitting the Russians in their respective trenches and dugouts. The 23rd Brigade is a unit that hitherto was not known to be operating in this part of the front line. The 23rd, they were designated with the Velika Novosibirsk sector, operating at Pryutny, sometimes Oruzhenie, that entire area. And that was their area of responsibility, especially during the later period of the counteroffensive. But it appears now they've been moved to this sector, likely in order to allow the 116th and 47th Mechanized Brigades to move some of their resources further south to deal with the situation on the southern parts of Avdiivka. And so by doing so, you now have the 23rd being moved in to help fill in any sort of gaps that were created. And because the Velika Novosibirsk sector was one of the lower intensity parts of the front line, the 23rd Mechanized Brigade may not have that high of an attrition level at the moment, which means they are more suitable for frontline activity right now. Now, moving on to Tabaivka, we don't really have full clarity, and that's because there's no geolocations of a Russian advance into the village. What we do know is that the first claims of a Russian capture circulated on the 27th of January, with Deep State, for instance, saying that it was not captured yet by the Russians, but that they were launching heavy attacks, especially by the 47th, I think, Tank Division, just to the east of the village. And then by the early 28th, Deep State did report that the Russians got full control over the village, with the Ukrainians having to move in reserves to stabilize the front line. And then by the end of the day, the Deep State source claimed that the Ukrainians were able to hold the line and push back the Russians from some of their positions within the village, leaving most of it as a gray zone. Now, I can't confirm or deny any of that. At the same time, Russian sources, they've been saying something that's actually to the opposite of that effect. From Deep State, they're claiming that the Russian forces were able to capture Tabaivka by 27th or 28th, and that since then they've been expanding control, including control south of Tabaivka, getting control of some of the fields and ditches that are located directly east of Pischane and to the west of Krokhmalny. And they claim that the Russian forces were able to advance in some fields south of Kotlyarivka, securing some very important positions along the road, along the heights, and just trying to, in general, flank the Ukrainian groupings in Synkivka and Tabaivka that are rather strong and fortified. I can't confirm any of that. And they're also claiming, as of the 29th, that the Russian forces are assaulting the Ukrainian positions located to the west of Tabaivka, which are important. I'll get to in a second why. But they do acknowledge that there have been attempts by the Ukrainians to launch counterattacks to the west. So really now what's being debated is whether those Ukrainian counterattacks were successful in pushing back and making Tabaivka a gray zone, or whether the Russian forces so far have been able to hold on to those positions. What I do know for a fact is that Tabaivka is in a very really murky situation. It is very tricky to hold on to the positions over there, and that's because when you look at the east and to the west, Tabaivka is in a valley that is surrounded by two ridges. The Russians have control of one ridge and the Ukrainians have control of the other. And holding on to one ridge in Tabaivka is very untenable. because Tabaivka itself is inundated with swampy conditions. It is very hard to hold that position, especially when your opponent has control of hills that are directly overlooking it. And so holding on to the Tabaivka alone without getting control of both ridges is an extremely difficult situation for either side, which does explain why the Russian forces would try to assault westwards and why the Ukrainians are desperately trying to hold on to that western hill area. Now, we're looking into the troop composition on this part of the front line. You'll see that I've added in a massive amount of Russian and Ukrainian units over the past few days. The main unit that I mentioned was the 47th Tank Division, which has established several new tank regiments that can be seen on my map, like this one and this one, for instance, that were previously not in existence. They were only created in early 2023. And in addition, in terms of just general infantry units, you have BARS 5 and BARS 9 battalions. So these are volunteer units. You have motor rifle regiment in the area and several other units that are involved in such assaults, not just on Tabaivka, but also further north in some of the armored and infantry-based operations that were occurring around Avdiivka that have really died down in recent months. And then looking at the Ukrainian side, there is a pretty interesting breakdown in the general area spanning from the just area to the west of Orlyansk, going all the way to the south to around like Novomykhailivka, this general area. That region has around 4 Ukrainian mechanized brigades, 2 separate battalions, 1 tank battalion, a territorial defense brigade, and then the special operations unit Kraken. And there are many other additional units that are defending specifically on the Kupiansk fronts that have certain elements of their units that could easily be diverted to send reserves to defend against any sort of Russian breakthrough. And speaking of the area to the north of Kupiansk, if you recall, there were various Russian armored assaults that were repelled by the Ukrainian 30th Mechanized Brigade along this particular road leading into Synkivka. And so the Russians have shifted focus recently and started launching attacks a bit further to the west through this forested area with infantry, not really with in armored components. And this was caught on camera by the Ochi drone group. They dropped grenades on Russian forces that were advancing in the forest north of Synkivka, likely with the goal of flanking it and getting control of positions that are located further westwards and not directly to the north. And so they were targeted by the drone group itself, and by virtue of those targets, we do now have confirmation of a slight Russian advance that was recorded in this area over here. And in response to this Russian advance, the Ukrainians sent in certain elements of the 60th Mechanized Brigade, a unit which is also on the Oskil River front but is operating further south, and also has certain elements that are operating on the border with Russia around Kharkiv. And so they sent at least 1 tank to engage with the Russian positions at this geolocated marker. Not this one, but the one over here. And so that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.